For the first time in 3.5 years, there's a real chance that the Russian invasion of Ukraine could end. Or, to be a bit more accurate, there's a chance that it could stop in its tracks, with Vladimir Putin choosing to end the violence, swap a bit of territory, and enter a period of peace while sitting on about a fifth of Ukraine's pre-war landmass. If that seems like a raw deal for Ukraine, well, that is because it is a raw deal for Ukraine, but according to Ukraine's leader and his partners in Europe, it might be a price worth paying to stop the bloodshed. But it'll be this. When is a peace not really a peace? And the answer is that's when both sides recognize that a truce is little more than a pause in the violence, and that if past predicts future, Vladimir Putin's ambitions will not be satisfied with just a fifth of Ukrainian territory under his control. If Ukraine and Russia can agree to terms of a peace, and let's be clear, that is a massive if, then both sides will enter a new kind of contest, shoring up their fortifications, bolstering their militaries, calling on their allies, and making ready for a second phase of the conflict that could start at any time. The peace deal that's starting to take place in Eastern Europe is not the kind of peace where everybody gets to breathe a big sigh of relief. It's the kind of peace that leads into a very tense few months and then a very tense few years in which Ukraine will have to build itself into an impenetrable fortress before Russia is ready to swallow it whole. Peace as a starting gun. Okay, so before we begin today, we've got to talk about the timing, because although the talks to find a peace framework for Ukraine are still in their early stages, anything could happen between the time that this episode is written and the time that it comes out. In fact, it's an open question whether there will even be a peace process by the time you see this, or whether the entire thing's just collapsed and rendered this discussion strictly hypothetical. Now, to that end, everything that we discuss in this episode is up to date to the best of our knowledge and ability as of the start of day Wednesday, the 20th of August, local time in Kiev. If anything major has changed by the time that you're seeing this, then rest assured that we will be back here to cover it. Now, we're not going to give a full background briefing on the peace discussion so far. Instead, we'll just refer you to an entire episode that we published on the very subject just a couple of days ago. But in broad strokes, here's where things stand at the time of writing. Over the weekend, Vladimir Putin and US President Donald Trump met up for a summit in Alaska without Ukraine present. And while at first it seemed as if not much progress would come out of the meeting, later revelations were enough to justify some extremely cautious optimism. According to US officials, Putin had expressed that he was open to Ukraine's allies stationing troops in the country and providing security guarantees. He'd also apparently told the Americans that if Ukraine relinquished its remaining territory in Donetsk Oblast, in the far east of the country, then he would be open to freezing the rest of the front line, letting go of an expectation that Russia would come to control the entirety of the 4 oblasts that it claims to have annexed, including territory that Russian soldiers have never actually captured. Meanwhile, Ukraine indicated that with the support of European allies, his nation was ready to discuss ceasefire terms that would default to a frozen front line, letting go of his prior stance that Ukraine couldn't accept any peace terms that left territory in Russian hands. There are still lots of outstanding issues, including Ukraine's insistence that a temporary ceasefire goes into effect before longer peace negotiations begin. But if sources describing Russia's negotiating position are to be taken at their word, then the two sides have each moved into a posture where detailed negotiations could at least begin. Again, check back on our other episode on Ukraine this week if you'd like to brush up on the details. Despite signs of what may or may not be genuine progress, there are still plenty of reasons to remain skeptical. For one thing, according to US and international outlets, Ukraine's allies in Europe don't seem to believe that these talks are going anywhere despite their public support for America's efforts. Quoting Politico on the issue, the European side thinks it's a win-win approach. They will be delighted to be proved wrong if the US president can negotiate an end to the Ukraine war with meaningful security guarantees, but the primary game plan is all about calling the Russian leader's bluff and lobbying for tougher sanctions. End quote. And that is to say, they believe that Putin is full of it and want to make sure that Trump sees Putin backing away from peace talks as soon as they become a real possibility. And as reports about Putin's negotiating position have hit the press, the Kremlin has pushed back publicly on some of that reporting, with Russian sources telling the global press that Putin hadn't made any hard agreements about anything except that further talks should take place. In fact, Russia isn't even agreeing to that anymore, at least not publicly, with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov claiming that although Russia hasn't declined negotiations with Ukraine, it's not committing to them either. And above all else, that's good cause to remember that Putin has a history of manipulating these sorts of processes, not to achieve a genuine peace settlement, but to pave the way for future Russian aggression. But if Putin's tendency toward manipulation is a reason to believe that these peace talks are doomed, then it's also a reason to seriously consider the possibility that a peace deal actually happens, because for Russia and for Ukraine, a peace deal isn't the end of this story. If a Ukraine ceasefire went into effect tomorrow, we can assume that it would look something like this. Luhansk and quite possibly Donetsk entirely under Russian control, the front lines frozen in 2 other oblasts, Ukrainian territory returned to Kiev in other scattered spots across the country, plus some sort of agreement from Ukraine not to join NATO in exchange for some sort of acceptance from Putin of a European security guarantee for Ukraine's future. But as we're going to explore at length, that agreement would afford Putin and his inner circle plenty of opportunities to manipulate, exploit, and otherwise turn the new peace to their own advantage. Now, at the same time, it would present Ukraine key opportunities to move fast, shore up its defenses, and ensure that regardless of what Vladimir Putin wants, Kiev becomes an impossible target to take. Moscow's Machiavelli. Okay, let's start with Russia, where as soon as a peace deal goes into effect, and even before that, we can expect Moscow to be laying the groundwork for a rapid rearmament and return to its aggressive posture. Before a theoretically permanent truce can be finalized, Russia can stack the deck in its favor by placing controls on Ukrainian rearmament, limiting the size of Ukraine's military or the range of equipment that it can procure. Russia can put pressure on Ukraine's European allies to accept non-allied nations as part of a security guarantee, demanding that a nation like China get a vote and deploy its own soldiers as part of any coalition of the willing, or it can insist that it should control parts of Ukraine beyond a frozen front line, building a rhetorical argument to invade again. But once an officially agreed peace accord does take effect across Eastern Europe, the first step that Russia will probably consider is a fast break, a surprise assault launched as quickly as possible from parts of the Donbas region that have come under Russian control. There are a few reasons that Ukraine has worked so hard to hold on to the country's east, and particularly the strategic city of Pokrovsk, but one of the most important reasons is this. Pokrovsk and the surrounding area are part of the Ukrainian Wall, a 3-layered defensive arrangement that Ukraine built prior to Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. To be more specific, Pokrovsk is part of the last layer of that defense, and if Ukraine hands over control of Donetsk Oblast to Russia, then it also hands over control of the defensive lines that have kept the rest of the country safe. Attacking from a position of full control over Donetsk, Russia has a straight shot to Kiev, as well as major cities like Kharkiv and Dnipro. To get there, Russian armored columns would be crossing vast open plains with minimal natural obstructions or barriers, and they'd be moving through areas that Ukraine hasn't fortified nearly as extensively as they've done in the Donbas region. And even with as little as a couple of months to prepare, Russia stands a good chance of taking Kiev under the right circumstances. If you think back to the early months of 2022, it was a lightning assault that the world expected from Russia. But it ultimately fizzled out. But why? Russian columns were short on logistical support, short on fuel, short on tactical know-how, but all of those lessons are ones that Russia's military leaders have learned several times over since Moscow had to shift into Plan B. Without a doubt, Ukrainian soldiers deserve immense credit for capitalizing on Russia's misstep and making Moscow pay. But without those tactical failures, it's unlikely that any Ukrainian resolve could have stopped what was coming. Now, Russia can take time to resupply units near the front, train its conscripts for a rapid advance, and build up as many troops as it wants on territory that it controls before an all-out sprint across the frozen front line at a moment of Moscow's choosing. Now, we'll discuss Ukraine's options to prevent that lightning assault in the next chapter, but suffice it to say that this concern is at the top of the list for Ukrainian civil leaders and military planners alike. In the event that a lightning assault doesn't happen, Russia would have major incentives to keep the process of rearmament going for as long as possible, not just to try and intimidate Ukraine, but to keep its own economy afloat. Russia shifted into a full-scale war economy once the invasion began, taking advantage of exceptionally high rates of military spending in order to keep the economy rolling despite sanctions pressure, relative economic isolation, and a range of other challenges that might have led to economic collapse. Even now, Russia's economy seems to be overheating, and the nation will definitely pay a heavy price if it were to shift out of its wartime alignment. So, despite the long-term costs, Putin is incentivized to keep that war economy going for as long as possible. In order to accomplish that, Russia's got to keep on pouring money into its military-industrial complex, artificially stringing the economy along while factories churn out tanks, artillery pieces, and other warfighting equipment, potentially at higher and higher rates. That military build-up can then be used to threaten Ukraine with equipment and ammunition that comes in higher volumes, at higher quality, or in newer and more sophisticated models. Then there's the political side of the equation, where we can expect Russia to take a very active interest in Ukrainian affairs for the foreseeable future. Every parliamentary election, every election at the oblast level, and certainly every time Ukraine elects a president, the nation can expect to see all manner of Russian interference, from cyber attacks to influence campaigns and more. Get leaders into office who might be more Russia-friendly, who might advocate deprioritizing Ukraine's future defense or its military-industrial complex, or who might get into more frequent scuffles with Europe, and Moscow stands to gain. Similarly, if Moscow can get Ukraine to restrict the size of its own military in exchange for the protection of a European coalition of the willing, then Moscow gets another pressure point to take advantage of. Play its cards right, and Russia could turn that coalition of the willing into a coalition of the unwilling, driving a wedge between Ukraine and its international partners either overtly or behind the scenes. And while, in this hypothetical version of events, Russia declines the opportunity to attempt a near-immediate lightning assault after a peace is declared, it would also have the opportunity to invade Ukraine again once it's built up to a level of military readiness that Moscow finds acceptable. In a head-to-head contest, with no external help on either side, Ukraine versus Russia will always be a balance that tilts unavoidably in Russia's favor, even despite Ukraine's ability to put up an exceptionally tough fight. So, in a version of Eastern Europe where Russia does agree to a peace, Moscow's next steps will be focused on trimming out the intermediaries that might help Ukraine defend itself, which will diminish Ukraine's ability to fight a war independently and set the conditions for a direct one-against-one battle that Russia is just primed to win. Have you ever landed in a new country and immediately got hunting for Wi-Fi like it's a survival item? Oh my god, ad read, yes! Like, literally landing the plane, you're on the tarmac, and I'm like, ooh, I wonder if I can reach the airport Wi-Fi. My life. But look, it never works, and you don't want to use that local data because it's outrageously expensive. I have been so shafted by that. I once got so shafted that I just got a new SIM card and didn't pay the bill, which I'm sure was great for my credit score. I mean, allegedly I did that. It's an eSIM app that gives you mobile data in over 190 countries. No swapping SIM cards, no standing in line at the airport, no surprising roaming charges. Once you install it, you're good to go. One eSIM covers multiple countries, so you don't have to reinstall anything when you cross borders. Plans are affordable, work on iOS and Android, and there's even an ad blocker built in to help you save data. Get an exclusive 15% discount on Saley data plans. Use the code WarFronts at checkout, so download the Saley app or go to saley.com/warfronts. For the Homeland. Now here's a problem that might arise if Russia were to agree to a peace today in order to rest, reset, and ultimately restart a Ukraine invasion tomorrow. Every moment that Russia spends in a state of peace, Ukraine spends in a state of peace as well, and just like Russia will be working overtime to set the conditions for conquest, Ukraine will have the opportunity to work toward precisely the opposite goal. If Ukraine agrees to the terms of the deal that's taking shape now, then make no mistake, Ukraine is making a bet and hoping that with time it can create conditions in which Russia wouldn't dare march on Kiev a second time. We'll start with the same scenario we led with. In Russia's case, a rapid rearmament on Russian territory, the formation of large armored columns, and when the moment is right, a lightning assault on the territory that Ukraine still holds. For Ukraine, this is the single greatest threat that would come with the peace deal, that Russia could reform its lines and invade again before Ukraine can build defenses that are anywhere near what they'd need to be in order to stop that kind of assault. Ukraine poured resources into its defensive lines in the Donbass for many years, and with Donetsk and Luhansk ceded to Russian control, those defensive lines would be worth nothing. Ukraine could replace them with new fortifications set back from the new front lines, but that'll take time, and if Russia wants to turn around and attack again as soon as possible, then time is a luxury that Ukraine cannot afford. But Ukraine isn't alone. And under the ceasefire terms that Moscow is reportedly open to, Ukraine would be able to rely on a coalition of the willing led by its allies in Europe. This is a plan that the United States has indicated that it would sign on to, providing air and logistical support and other capabilities while European-led forces supply troops and the bulk of the combat equipment. The specifics behind a coalition of the willing in Ukraine are a closely guarded secret, to the extent that participating nations haven't even figured those details out yet, but sources speaking to WarFronts some time ago provided us with an inkling of what that coalition could look like. That would include several thousand, although not several tens of thousands, of international soldiers on Ukrainian soil, backed up by a much more powerful naval and air component, with aircraft and ships stationed both on Ukrainian territory and on the territory of nearby NATO member nations, where any Russian attack that targets them would risk invoking NATO principles of collective defense. Ukraine, according to the most recent word from Washington, might benefit from a collective defense guarantee of its own, while France has explored the idea of extending its nuclear umbrella by deploying nuclear-armed jets to other NATO nations, potentially offering Ukraine a place under that umbrella as well. Rapidly deploy European and allied troops by way of a coalition of the willing, and Ukraine could stop a rapid Russian turnaround before it ever gets underway. At best, Russia would still need multiple months to reconsolidate its forces, whereas if European troops were willing to live in relative discomfort for a bit, it could take as little as a week or two for the first encampments of coalition soldiers to start popping up in areas near the front line. It wouldn't take much. Just European soldiers scattered across eastern Ukraine as a sort of tripwire for Russia to avoid. Harm those European soldiers and Europe's coalition will take action, bringing all sorts of sophisticated equipment that a few months of Russian rearmament just isn't going to be able to rival. Get the coalition of the willing into position, and Ukraine's allies could buy Kyiv the time that it needs to rest and resupply its own troops, build the first sets of new fortifications, or take other steps to ensure that Russia thinks twice before attacking. And just like Russia can benefit from keeping its war economy alive, Ukraine can convert its wartime military-industrial apparatus into a tool to build a European defense renaissance. Ukraine's weapons industry has been booming over the course of the war against Russia, especially its drone designers and manufacturers and other enterprises that work with advanced technology. But although Ukraine's economy is desperately in need of a break from war spending, one of the most valuable things that Ukraine's international allies could contribute to Kyiv would be a deluge of lucrative contracts to keep Ukrainian assembly lines open. For Europe, it's a win-win. London, Paris, Berlin, and Warsaw get to greatly enhance their own militaries, while ensuring that Ukrainian innovators and weapons factories can keep the lights on. International investment helps to stimulate the Ukrainian economy, reconstruct a battered nation, and ensure that when Ukraine's military is ready to start placing bulk orders, its domestic suppliers haven't gone out of business in the interim. Part and parcel with its domestic military industrial initiatives, Ukraine can devote more personnel to training on some of the advanced equipment Ukraine has already received from international partners, particularly combat aircraft, while purchasing or accepting donations or loans of other Western equipment. Without a water fight, Ukraine can spend time preparing its troops at its facilities to accommodate that advanced hardware while simultaneously beefing up its military so that in the event of a second Russian invasion, Ukraine will be more formidable than it ever was in 2022. Even better, Ukraine can take an approach similar to Taiwan, a so-called porcupine strategy that would see it stockpile long-range weapons that it could use against Russia at massive scale if Russia were foolish enough to try and attack. Ukraine already has ample drone designs that could be mass-produced for that purpose, and if those drones are combined with a vastly expanded arsenal of cruise and ballistic missiles, then Ukraine could advertise plainly to Russia that if Russia dares to attack, it'll find a torrential downpour of explosive munitions landing all across its precious territory. Russia's air defenses have already been shown to be quite vulnerable during the war, and air defenses are time-consuming and expensive to replace. Certainly, it would take much longer for Russia to replenish its stocks of S-400s than it would for Ukraine to fill decently sized bulk orders for a few different long-range missile and drone systems that are already in mass production. Most important of all, Ukraine can play the odds in its own favor and work Russia into the ultimate waiting game. Build an arsenal with deterrent power, welcome allied forces onto its territory, and see if Ukraine can't outlast the 72-year-old dictator at the head of the Russian Federation. Putin himself has long been a subject of speculation. He certainly hasn't been looking great in his recent appearances, and if Ukraine can keep Russia from attacking for, say, 3 to 5 years, then there's no telling what could happen to him in a country where he's already outlived the span of years that the average man could expect to survive. If, in Putin's absence, Russia were taken over by a more moderate or more risk-averse leader, then the threat of Russian invasion could go away literally overnight. Or even if Putin proves he can hold on for a few years more, Ukraine has substantially better odds of outlasting the Russian war economy. Russia cannot simply cook itself forever, and the longer that it attempts to artificially inflate its economy, the higher a price it'll pay in the long run once things inevitably come crashing down. If the Kremlin doesn't have the funds to support a war, then it doesn't particularly matter who would be sulking in the presidential palace. The practical outcome is the same either way. The ultimate gamble. For both Russia and Ukraine, the act of agreeing to a truce on their shared front line would constitute the ultimate gamble. By signing on the dotted line, Moscow and Kiev would each be making a bet that they could turn a ceasefire to their benefit at the other's expense. Moscow to lay the groundwork for a renewed and far quicker offensive, and Kiev to build itself into a fortress before Russia can intervene. It's a zero-sum game, and a game in which the penalty for the loser is catastrophic. Conquest in the case of Ukraine, or abject geopolitical failure in the case of Russia. But though the costs may be high, that doesn't mean that either Russia or Ukraine would be unwilling to try their luck. After all, continuing the war in its current form comes with risks of its own, for Putin and for Zelensky. From both nations' perspectives, there's something to be said for establishing at least a temporary peace while there's a chance, and then pivoting to play the long game, which both Russia and Ukraine have good reason to believe they could win. Again, all of this only happens if these two sides actually agree to a ceasefire, and there's a strong chance that they ultimately will not. But if they do, if the foundations of a peace accord that we're seeing this week can evolve into something real, then Ukraine and Russia both will be playing to win. In that scenario, Vladimir Putin has ample means and methods at his disposal to manipulate Ukraine, to drive it away from the West, or to accumulate power in order to conquer Kiev outright. But every single option for Russia takes time. And that's time that Ukraine will also have to fortify itself, reconstitute its military, reorient its defenses, and prepare to deter or defend against a reopening of the conflict. If Ukraine has time, Ukraine can win. And in the case of the sole exception, a rapid Russian assault before Ukraine can put itself together, it'll be up to the coalition of the willing to prove itself reliable so that Ukraine can be protected from a Russian fast break that could bring the whole nation down. If Ukraine can avoid that fate, then Ukraine has time. And if Ukraine has time in a period of relative peace, then Ukraine can protect what remains of its sovereignty for good. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be fair, but Kiev was expected to fall within the span of a week, all the way back in 2022. For Kiev in 2025 to secure a peace accord that could clear the path to survival for decades would be a hell of a welcome achievement. Thank you for watching.